Hello. Tonight we step into a landscape where warm rain gathers on broad jungle leaves, where distant thunder sounds like a breath held too long, and where the lives of ordinary people begin drifting toward a conflict that will reshape the world. The air is thick, the ground soft, and somewhere beyond the tree line, a quiet tension lingers like a warning. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And if you're listening right now, feel free to share where you are and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, soften your surroundings, and let's quietly step into tonight's story. The first drops fall without ceremony. They gather on palm fronds, slide down vines, and tap on wooden roofs in small villages scattered across the Vietnamese countryside. For many people living here, farmers tending rice paddies, children chasing chickens across muddy yards, elders sipping tea in shadowed porches, this rain is simply life. It has always come. But on this particular night, as insects buzz in wavering choruses and the warm mist hugs the earth, the rain feels different. Under its gentle patter, something else moves, the beginning of a long story of fire and storm. In these early years, before the war is officially a war, the tension resembles the heavy air before a monsoon. Families hear whispers of unrest in distant cities, about political tensions, about rival visions for the country's future. But their nights remain filled with the ordinary laughter over meals, the scrape of wooden stools on floors, the sound of radios playing old songs. Life continues because it must. Yet the rain keeps coming, almost as if the jungle itself senses what people cannot yet name. On the edges of the paddies, soldiers sometimes pass silently. They are not the hardened fighters history books often spotlight. They are young, often unsure, learning to read the land with careful steps. Some carry equipment patched together from old French supplies left over from earlier conflicts. Others wear simple cloth uniforms, their pockets filled with nothing more than rice balls and lucky charms. One quirky detail from the time hardly anyone expected it was the popularity of tiny hand-carved wooden animals kept as good luck tokens. They were sometimes swapped like secret gifts during shifts, a quiet ritual in the shadow of looming uncertainty. As the rain deepens, lanterns glow through the mist. A family in a bamboo house listens to a scratchy radio transmission, half-understood words drifting through static. Changes in government, foreign powers watching with interest, decisions being made far away that will soon echo into their daily lives. Historians still argue whether the seeds of unavoidable conflict were fully visible at this moment, or whether the country still had paths that might have steered it away from what was to come. But for the people here, those debates don't exist. They only know the smell of wet earth, the feel of worn tools in their hands, the comfort of routine. The jungle breathes heavily around them. Crickets sing in rhythmic patterns, frogs call from the ditches, and sometimes an unseen animal rustles through the undergrowth. The land feels alive, so alive that newcomers often describe it as overwhelming. One American advisor, years before full U.S. involvement, once joked that the jungle seemed like a roommate who never stopped talking. That small humour, shared later in letters home, only underlined how foreign everything felt to those newly arrived. This early presence of American advisors is a historical fact often overshadowed by later events. Before combat troops landed, hundreds of military advisors were already in Vietnam, observing, training, and wondering what they were stepping into. They walked through the same thick mud, listened to the same wildlife hum, and discovered quickly that Vietnam was not a place easily understood at first glance. The terrain seemed to shift moods, sunlit and serene 1 hour, dark and humming with unseen movement the next. Meanwhile, Across the countryside, villagers felt the subtle shift in atmosphere, not always through news, but through stories passed quietly from one place to another. A patrol seen near a road, a new checkpoint, a political poster appearing on a wall, a neighbour mentioning that their cousin was joining a group that promised change. These were the first hints, gentle enough to ignore, strong enough to remember. Rain falls harder now, rhythmic and insistent. It hits the thatched roofs like a soft drumline, sending children to huddle closer to the fire. Outside, water joins dirt to form thick puddles that reflect flashes of distant lightning. The storm hasn't arrived yet, but it is approaching, step by step. For some, the sound of the rain is soothing. For others, especially young men who've heard rumours of training camps deep in the woods, it brings a restless feeling. They sit on porches, watching the sheets of water blur the world into shapes and shadows. They think about duty, about family, about fear. None of them think of themselves as heroes, just people trying to understand the shifting ground beneath their feet. In the far reaches of the jungle, where paths narrow into tunnels of vines and towering trees, small groups meet in secret. They whisper about unity, resistance, independence, words that carry both hope and danger. These gatherings are not grand or romantic. They are awkward, cramped, sometimes nervous. A kerosene lamp flickered once, casting shadows on faces that held more determination than certainty. One participant later recalled that he was more afraid of leeches than anything political that night. The rain keeps drumming, insects keep humming, and somewhere between each drop, the first soft stirrings of a long conflict take shape, not in explosion or gunfire, but in the quiet shifting of choices, pressures, and the lives of those caught in the middle. The jungle, vast and watching, absorbs every sound. It is a beginning without ceremony, without headlines, just rain over a land that does not know yet how deeply it will change. The rain eases into a misty drizzle as the story shifts from villages and quiet porches to the long roads that brought Vietnam to its breaking point. These roads are not made of asphalt alone. They are paths of history, decisions, missed chances, and the heavy footsteps of those who tried to shape a nation according to their own visions. Long before soldiers hid in the jungle or helicopters lined the skies, the roots of a future fire were already alive beneath the soil. In the late 19th century, Vietnam became part of French Indochina, folded into an empire that stretched across Southeast Asia. The French built railways, ports, and schools, but they also controlled nearly every thread of power, land, trade, language, administration. Many ordinary Vietnamese worked the fields under heavy taxes or laboured on plantations that didn't belong to them. A mainstream historical fact often noted is that by the 1932, over half of the rice grown in southern Vietnam was exported, even as many farmers had too little to eat. It was an imbalance that simmered quietly for decades, creating a sense of a distant authority pressing down on a land that had its own rhythm and its own soul. And yet, even under colonial rule, life carried on. Markets bustled, temples filled with incense. Children learned French phrases at school in the morning and listened to folk tales from grandparents at night. Like the rain-soaked villages we just left, daily routines continued, never fully aware of how political currents far above them were gathering into something larger. Historians still argue whether this era made conflict inevitable or whether different compromises might have preserved unity. But whatever the possibilities, the reality grew heavier each year. Nationalist movements slowly rose from frustration and hope. Students discussed independence in cafes, workers whispered about rights on factory floors, and farmers spoke of freedom in the shade of bamboo groves. Some of these movements were peaceful and academic, others turned toward resistance and secrecy. And among the many voices, one began to stand out: Ho Chi Minh. For years he travelled across continents, studying, organising, observing global currents. His return to the Vietnamese struggle blended local grievances with broader ideas of self-determination. That mixture, uniquely Vietnamese, yet shaped by the world, would later define an era. Then came World War II, when Japan occupied Vietnam. For the villagers, it meant yet another foreign power taking control. Food shortages grew severe, and in 1945 famine struck with devastating force. One quirky, seldom mentioned detail from this time is that some villages used large ceremonial drums not for festivities, but to warn of incoming supply raids. The deep, echoing sound meant for celebration turned into a note of dread. When Japan surrendered, a brief window opened, power structures collapsed, and the August Revolution ignited, declaring Vietnam independent. The moment felt electric, filled with pride and possibility. But the world beyond Vietnam had its own plans. France returned, determined to reclaim its colonies. Soon, the First Indochina War began, a conflict of trenches, mountain passes, grit, and willpower. Ordinary people, once farmers and shopkeepers, found themselves drawn into a struggle for the shape of their homeland. The decisive turning point came in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, where Vietnamese forces surrounded and defeated the French garrison. It was a historic moment, one that signalled the end of French colonial power in the region. Yet the victory did not bring unity. Instead, negotiations in Geneva temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, a communist north and a non-communist south. The division was meant to be temporary, with elections planned for reunification, but those elections never happened. Here again, historians still argue whether the elections were truly feasible or whether political pressures from both domestic and international players made them impossible from the start. What is clear is that the Cold War was tightening its grip. The United States, wary of communist expansion, supported the South. The Soviet Union and China supported the North. Vietnam became not just a country choosing its future, it became a space where superpowers projected their fears and ambitions. In homes across the South, families debated their uncertain path. Some believed in the government in Saigon. Others felt loyalty to the North or to local movements that promised justice and equality. Thousands of Northern supporters living in the South moved northward during the 1954 exodus, carrying their memories and hopes with them. Likewise, many Southerners who feared communist rule journeyed south. These migrations were massive, emotional, and confusing people, carrying bundles of clothing, photographs, tools, even beloved pets on crowded barges and trains. One story passed around as a warm, almost humorous memory involved a man who insisted on smuggling his rooster aboard a transport ship because, as he said, no home feels like home without its morning argument. But beneath such small moments lived a deeper ache, a nation torn not by its people, but by lines drawn during negotiations far from its soil. Throughout the late 1950s, tensions rose as small clashes, political crackdowns, and underground movements created an atmosphere of distrust. Advisors from the United States began arriving not as soldiers yet, but as mentors to South Vietnam's forces. They walked through fields, inspected bases, and submitted reports filled with cautious optimism and quiet worry. Many expected the conflict to remain limited, believing that a mix of training and aid would stabilize the region. They underestimated the complexity of the terrain, the depth of nationalist sentiment, and the determination of those in the north who saw reunification as non-negotiable. Meanwhile, the villagers, the same ones who listened to radio static in the rain, felt the changes like the shifting of seasons. Posters appeared on walls. Night meetings became more common. Checkpoints multiplied along roads that once carried nothing more than bicycles and water buffalo. Life didn't collapse all at once. It changed slowly, subtly, drop by drop, like the first hints of a coming storm. By the early 1960s, the roads that led to war were fully formed. They wound through colonial memory, foreign ambitions, failed accords, and the hopes of millions. None of these roads were straight, and none belonged entirely to Vietnam anymore. But they all pointed toward the same horizon, the one where the rain would give way to fire. The mist lingers after the rain, settling low over the earth and mixing with cooking fire smoke that rises in thin, wavering strands. Across Vietnam's long, narrow spine, life resumes in its steady rhythm, yet something in the air feels unsettled, as if the wind itself is deciding which direction to blow. The division at the 17th parallel has drawn a line across the land, but far more than geography is splitting apart. The hearts, fears, and loyalties of millions begin to pull in different directions, creating fractures that no map can fully capture. In the north, the government presses forward with land reforms, political organising, and plans for a unified socialist future. Loudspeakers in village squares announce new policies, new slogans, new expectations. The tone is confident, sometimes forceful, sometimes hopeful, shaped by a belief that reunification is not just possible, but inevitable. Families gather under stilted houses to listen to long broadcasts explaining the struggle ahead, while officials visit hamlets to rally support. There is optimism, yes, but also fear. Stories circulate of mistakes in land reform programs, of harsh punishments handed out when anger outweighed judgment. Historians still argue whether these early reforms strengthened national unity or frayed trust among rural communities. What everyone agrees on is that they marked the beginning of a much larger transformation, one that would ripple down to every village path. Meanwhile, in the south, the government in Saigon builds its own vision, one focused on anti-communism, modernization, and ties to Western allies. City squares bustle with construction and commerce, and new buildings rise beside French-era villas. Radios advertise foreign products, while newspapers debate political unrest. Yet beneath the urban progress, deeper tensions simmer. Many rural areas feel neglected, caught between the Saigon government's directives and the growing influence of insurgent groups who move quietly through the countryside. For villagers, allegiance becomes complicated, less about ideology and more about survival and trust. Local officials sometimes push strict loyalty campaigns, asking villagers to declare their stance publicly. But these communities have lived through decades of upheaval, colonialism, war, occupation, and promises of stability sound fragile. One quirky detail from this period. In certain provinces, families would hang bamboo wind chimes at the edge of their property, not just for decoration, but to signal whether it was safe for neighbours to visit. A silent yard meant tensions were high. A ringing chime meant calm, at least for the moment. The winds of political division blow strongest at night. That's when messages pass through forests, when small meetings form in hidden groves, when whispers spread faster than official decrees. Young men disappear into the trees to join the growing insurgency known as the Viet Cong, believing they are stepping into a long path toward national liberation. Others enlist in the South's army, proud to defend their homes from what they see as dangerous ideology. Both sides feel conviction, both sides feel fear, and both sides walk roads paved with uncertainty. The United States watches these changes closely. Advisors file detailed reports to Washington, describing rural instability and the structure of the insurgent networks. The tone of the reports shifts over time from cautious optimism to quiet alarm. A mainstream historical fact often highlighted is that by 1963, the number of American military advisors had grown into the thousands, far beyond the original scope. They conducted patrols with South Vietnamese units, built small compounds, and tried to assess a conflict that often hid behind foliage, customs, and grievances older than the advisors themselves. Control begins slipping through fingers like river sand. In some provinces, government presence is strong during the day but vanishes with the sunset. In others, insurgents blend so seamlessly with local life that officials cannot distinguish supporter from bystander. This erosion isn't sudden, it's gradual, creeping, the kind of change villagers describe as like termites in a post. One night everything seems stable, the next the structure feels hollow. Across the north, officials prepare for a long struggle. Across the south, leaders worry about loyalty and legitimacy. And across the world, powerful nations see Vietnam as part of a larger challenge. China and the Soviet Union support Hanoi in different ways, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes competitively. The U.S. grows more deeply involved with Saigon, fearing the domino effect that policymakers warn about. Yet strangely, despite the global attention, many Vietnamese feel more isolated than ever caught between ideologies that claim to speak for them, while their daily realities remain rooted in harvests, markets, festivals, and family. As the political winds strengthen, the landscape itself seems to react. Roads that once hosted bicycle traffic begin to host checkpoints. Schools add lessons about national duty. Local markets become places of uneasy conversation. Who trusts whom? Who's leaving the village? Who's been seen speaking to unfamiliar visitors? Even the jungle takes on new significance. It becomes not just nature, but shelter, hiding place, and passageway. Along riverbanks, old men playing cards pause to exchange news of skirmishes on distant trails. In cafes, students discuss philosophy and revolutionary ideas while sipping iced coffee. Some murmur about the need for reform, others about resisting infiltration. Everyone feels the air changing, even if they cannot yet grasp the scale of what lies ahead. And control, true control, becomes elusive. Saigon struggles to establish authority in rural districts. Hanoi struggles to manage the differing goals of its foreign allies. Washington struggles to understand the depth of local grievances. No one fully holds the reins. Even nature seems unpredictable. Floods wash away planned routes, droughts shift agricultural needs, and monsoon winds scatter careful plans like leaves. Somewhere in the midst of these changes, a small boy in the Mekong Delta watches dragonflies skim over irrigation canals. His mother worries about rumours of nearby fighting. His father considers whether to remain neutral or choose a side. The boy simply listens to the wind brushing the tall grass, unaware that his childhood is being shaped by forces far beyond the horizon. The winds before the storm gather strength quietly. They rustle bamboo groves, carry rumours between villages, shake posters loose from walls, and drift through government halls in both north and south. These winds do not yet roar, but they are relentless, drawing two halves of a nation farther and farther apart, preparing the land for the coming tempest. The morning haze rises slowly from the riverbanks, blending with cooking smoke and the thin blue trails drifting from village hearths. But beyond these everyday wisps lies another kind of smoke, one that forms not from wood or fire, but from the invisible tension stretched across continents. Vietnam, still fragile from political fracture, now finds itself pulled into a game designed far from its mountains and paddies. The Cold War, vast and unyielding, begins drawing its lines here, making the country a crossroads of global ambitions. In Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, Vietnam becomes more than a nation. It becomes a symbol. Leaders speak of it in terms of doctrine, balance, and ideology, measuring its future not in fields harvested or families displaced, but in how it fits into a global contest. A mainstream historical fact often taught today is that by the early 1962, Vietnam had become one of the most watched regions in the world. Every shift in its politics or conflict reported, analysed, and fed into the strategies of major powers who believed their influence hung in the balance. But for the people living in Vietnam, these strategies translate into new tensions taking root in their towns and forests. In the north, shipments from the Soviet Union and China arrive by rail and road crates of weapons, supplies, machinery, and materials to support a long revolutionary struggle. Advisors help train soldiers, teach manufacturing techniques, and assist with infrastructure. Yet Hanoi has to walk carefully. Their two powerful allies are not always aligned. China favours guerrilla strategies based on mobility and endurance. The Soviet Union leans towards stronger conventional capabilities. And so, quietly, debates form inside the North's leadership, whose approach to follow, and how to maintain independence while accepting vital aid. Historians still argue whether these differences strengthened Hanoi's flexibility in strategy or created tensions that slowed early operations. Further south, the United States increases its footprint around Saigon. American advisors expand training programs, coordinate intelligence efforts, and begin shaping national security plans. New compounds appear near airfields. Military helicopters, still few in number, occasionally thrum overhead, drawing curious stares from villagers who have never seen machines like them. The U.S. sees South Vietnam as a critical barrier against communist expansion, believing that if it falls, neighbouring nations may follow. The domino theory, repeated in speeches and reports, becomes a guiding idea. Whether it accurately reflected regional realities remains debated even today. In the cafes of Saigon, American presence becomes a topic of fascination and confusion. Students talk about foreign movies, Western music, and the promise of modernization, while veterans of the anti-French struggles question whether one foreign power has simply replaced another. At street corners, vendors joke lightly about the sudden demand for strong iced coffee among visiting American personnel. A small detail, but one that leads to the quirky development of new variations of the drink, tailored to Western tastes, and later becoming surprisingly popular. Meanwhile, the South Vietnamese government stands at the centre of increasingly complex expectations. Leaders in Saigon must satisfy their own population, fend off insurgent influence, and align with American plans. It's a delicate balancing act, and sometimes an impossible one. Policies designed to centralize control often conflict with rural customs. Reforms intended to build stability sometimes deepen resentment. Advisors suggest one thing, local officials insist on another. Nothing feels simple anymore. In the countryside, invisible strings pull just as firmly. Supporters of the Viet Cong build shadow administrations in remote villages, collecting information, providing assistance, and spreading ideology. They speak of liberation, equality, and reunification. To many villagers, they seem familiar neighbours, cousins, young people from down the road. But they are also part of a larger network, one increasingly shaped by external forces. Chinese instructors share tactics. Soviet engineers advise on communication systems. The conflict grows less local with each passing month. And lurking behind all of this is perception, the way global powers see each other through events in Vietnam. A border skirmish, a political shift, a small battle deep in the jungle can spark memo chains thousands of miles away. Leaders sit in high-ceilinged rooms, pointing at maps, tracing arrows over terrain they have never touched, making decisions that will echo across the lives of farmers and children who cannot imagine those distant halls. Back in Vietnam, smoke rises from more than kitchen fires. Old French roads are repaired for transport, and the dust they kick up mixes with the lingering haze. Small skirmishes break out in provinces whose names will one day become widely known: Binh Duong, Quang Ngai, Tay Ninh. Yet for now, these clashes feel like shadows ominous, but not yet consuming. The storm's thunder is still distant, but its low rumble grows steadily louder. In villages near the border of Laos, people notice strangers passing through the forests more frequently. Scouts, couriers, young recruits travelling toward northern training bases. A fisherman pulling in his nets might glimpse them crossing a river at dawn. A woodcutter, hearing unusual movement in the underbrush, might pause, sensing that something beyond wildlife stirs there. Each encounter is brief, like catching sight of smoke drifting through trees before it disappears. At times, the international nature of the conflict creates almost surreal moments. One tale passed around in later years describes a Vietnamese officer attempting to translate a Soviet training manual while a Chinese advisor insisted they were misinterpreting a diagram. The two argued over phrasing, while local soldiers watched in polite bewilderment. As one joked later, it was easier to fight the French than to understand three different translations of the same sentence. Yet, even in these lighter stories, the weight of global ambition presses down. Every decision made in the north or the south has become part of a wider chessboard, one with pieces controlled far beyond Hanoi or Saigon. Every skirmish, every negotiation, every village rumour feeds into a narrative that stretches from Asia to Europe to America. And slowly, the lines drawn in smoke grow darker, sharper. They divide allies from enemies, strategies from hopes, futures from pasts. They turn Vietnam from a nation healing from colonial rule into a crucial symbol in a global struggle. As the sun dips low and shadows stretch across paddies and city streets alike, the horizon feels charged. Not yet aflame, but smouldering, shaped by hands near and far, waiting for the moment when the smoke thickens into something far more consuming. The jungle did not welcome them. It absorbed them. At first light, when the mist rose from the ground like the breath of something ancient, the soldiers on both sides learned the true ruler of Vietnam's interior. Not generals, not governments, not ideologies, only the rainforest. Its trees held centuries of quiet memory, and its vines curled with a patient indifference to human plans. For the men who marched into its depths, the war became less about enemies and more about understanding how to survive under the canopy of a living, breathing world. The leaves dripped constantly, even when the sky withheld rain. Water clung to everything: helmets, rifles, eyebrows, and the steady drone of insects filled every inch of silence. Soldiers moved in narrow lines, one behind the other, boots sinking into soft soil as birds called warnings from unseen branches. Many were young, some barely past boyhood, clutching weapons they had learned to assemble more quickly than they had learned to shave. At this stage of the war, battles were not the sweeping confrontations later known to history. They were encounters, small clashes that flared without warning and vanished just as quickly. Patrols disappeared into the green without leaving whispers behind. and when gunfire did erupt, it was swallowed by vegetation so thick that echoes had no space to return. On the North Vietnamese side, fighters moved with practiced familiarity. Many had grown up near forests, used to reading shadows as one reads a map. They knew which trees held nests that might give away enemy movement, which patches of ground were soft enough to muffle steps, which streams carried sound farther than expected. Their uniforms blended with the earth, and their supplies were light: a rifle, a small pack, a canteen, and resolve that came less from ideology and more from a belief that they were defending their homes. For the South Vietnamese troops, and later the arriving Americans, the jungle's rules were foreign. Men found themselves battling more than an adversary. They battled heat, insects, rot, and an ever-present sense of being watched. Leeches clung to ankles without warning. Sweat soaked fabrics before dawn. Boots disintegrated in weeks, and the forest, always shifting, seemed to reshape paths that had been certain just hours earlier. The early confrontations were strange, almost spectral. A patrol would advance, eyes searching the green walls around them, only to find shadows turning into motions, quick, precise, and then gone. A rustle might be wind. It might be someone exhaling behind a tree. A single rifle shot might signal an attack, or it might be nothing but a lone hunter beyond the hill. Fear became a quiet companion. Soldiers slept lightly, gripping their weapons as though they might dissolve overnight. Stories spread about the enemy, moving silently through tunnels beneath the earth, appearing behind trees with impossible speed. Some tales were exaggerated, others were not. The Viet Cong were indeed building a subterranean world, tunnels, storage chambers, trapdoors hidden beneath leaves that allowed them to fight and vanish with the forest itself as their shield. One American platoon commander wrote in a letter home, "It isn't that we can't see the enemy. It's that the jungle chooses who we see and when." His words echoed the feelings of many who slowly realized that the fight here would not follow familiar patterns. The enemy was not always visible. The terrain refused to be controlled. Rain was constant. When storms rolled across the canopy, the world became a blurred curtain of water, thick enough to erase the notion of direction. Soldiers huddled under ponchos, small fires impossible to light, rations growing damp. After the storms, the ground turned into a sucking mire that swallowed footprints and made simple walking feel like dragging chains. And yet, in these early months, there were long stretches of absolute stillness. Patrols could march for days without seeing another soul, encountering only the rustling of monkeys, the distant call of a hornbill, or the sight of orchids blooming in impossible colours high on the trunks of ancient trees. Some men found themselves lulled into believing the jungle held a strange beauty. Others found the silence unnerving, as if the forest were preparing itself for something unseen. The first notable battle in these dense regions was more confusion than strategy. A small South Vietnamese patrol encountered a hidden North Vietnamese outpost near a creek. The firefight lasted minutes, maybe less, and when it ended, the air hung thick with the smell of gunpowder and wet leaves. The survivors on both sides retreated deeper into the foliage, shaken not by the casualties, but by how quickly the world had erupted into chaos and returned to calm. Encounters like these spread across the countryside, brief flashes of violence, followed by days of tense waiting. Each side tried to adapt. South Vietnamese forces trained to read the land. Americans studied maps that could not capture the forest's textures. Northern fighters refined their ability to move silently, using the earth like a second skin. The jungle itself remained neutral but merciless. It hid traps that did not care about uniform colours, pits lined with sharpened stakes, tripwires leading to grenades balanced in branches, bamboo spikes coated with mud. Soldiers joked grimly that the forest was the third army in the conflict, one that required no food, no ammunition, only patience. Nights were the most difficult. Darkness beneath the canopy was complete, a blackness that swallowed all outlines. Lanterns or flashlights risked revealing positions, so men sat in near-perfect shadows, listening to the clicking of insects, the distant rumble of thunder, and their own breathing. Many wrote letters by feel alone, words uneven but sincere. Some prayed, some stared into the void, wondering what or who might be staring back. But amid the tension, there was also humanity. South Vietnamese villagers led lost patrols to safe paths. North Vietnamese soldiers shared rainwater with strangers stranded in the same storm. In fleeting moments, men remembered they were not born enemies. They had simply been placed here on opposite sides of a landscape older and more powerful than any political argument. As weeks turned to months, the rainforest claimed its place as a silent witness. It shaped every decision, every fear, every rumour. Soldiers came to understand that before facing each other, they had to face the terrain. And by the time the larger battles of the war began to form, both sides had been changed by these green labyrinths, hardened by humidity, sharpened by uncertainty, and humbled by a world that recognized no borders. Here, in the heart of the forest, the early war took root, not in explosions or declarations, but in whispers, carried through wet leaves and footsteps swallowed by soil. The Rainforest of Shadows taught its lessons quietly, and everyone who walked beneath its canopy carried those lessons with them into the long, unfolding conflict ahead. The first thing they noticed was the heat, not the ordinary heat of Vietnam's lowlands, but a different kind, one that shimmered in the distance like a living presence. Men looked toward the horizon and saw what seemed at first to be sunlight bending strangely until the truth revealed itself in a rising column of black smoke. Moments later came the delayed rumble, low and rolling, as if the earth itself had coughed. It was napalm, falling somewhere beyond the next ridge. Before the war escalated, the jungle had felt like a maze. Now it felt like a battlefield that could change shape without warning. The trees had been thick enough to hide whole platoons. Now, in places where flames had swept, only charred stumps remained silent. Burnt monuments stretching across the hills like the bones of some ancient creature. And yet just beyond those exposed scars, the rainforest still stood untouched, dense and unyielding. Fire created openings, shadows filled them, and soldiers stepped into landscapes that shifted from claustrophobic green to blinding scorched light in minutes. For both sides, this period of the war was defined by extremes. The brutality of napalm, the cunning of hidden traps, the eerie skill with which enemies vanished after striking. Many soldiers admitted later that the psychological battle was often harder than the physical one. A man could convince himself to run through gunfire. It was harder to steady his breath when he felt eyes on him but saw only trees. Napalm changed everything. When the canisters burst, flames spread with unnatural speed, clinging to branches, leaves, even water. The fire roared, consuming oxygen so quickly that men near the edge felt the air pull sharply against their lungs. The orange glow danced along the forest floor, twisting like serpents in the underbrush. South Vietnamese and American pilots believed they were clearing enemy positions, creating open fields where ambushes would be harder to execute. But the jungle was ancient and resilient, and in many places it returned frighteningly fast, new shoots sprouting stubbornly through ash days after the bombardment. On the ground, soldiers walked with caution. Even areas cleared by fire were dangerous. Tree trunks still smouldered, and roots cracked open under boots, revealing embers hidden inside like the glowing cores of forgotten fires. Patrols moved slowly, reflexively tightening grips on rifles as they entered shadowed sections where the forest had survived the flames. Every intact thicket seemed suspicious. Every rustle could be an ambush. And ambushes came swiftly. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army had mastered the art of invisibility. They knew how sound moved through vegetation, how to position themselves where the light broke unevenly, how to disappear into holes barely large enough to crawl through. A patrol might march for hours before a single rifle shot snapped the world into chaos. Soldiers dove for cover, only to find that the enemy was already gone, melted into the green as though the forest had reclaimed them. American and South Vietnamese troops grew wary of trails that looked too clean, too well used. Often they led to traps. Punji pits, lined with sharpened bamboo, waited beneath fragile mats of leaves. Tripwires strung between roots triggered grenades or swinging stakes. Some traps were simple, others were ingeniously cruel. Entire platoons learned to scan the ground, like men studying a sacred text, searching for signs that something wasn't quite right, a disturbed patch of soil, an unnatural mound, a vine stretched too straight. Fear travelled with them like a hand on the shoulder. Yet even amid the worst ambushes, the jungle remained more than an adversary. It became shelter. When mortars fell, soldiers hugged the roots of massive trees, trusting the earth to protect them. When aircraft roared overhead, the canopy offered concealment. Men on both sides learned to read the angles of sunlight filtering through leaves, to recognize when a branch had been bent by a passing foot, to sense when the forest's natural rhythm had been disturbed by something human. There were nights when the rain fell so heavily that even artillery seemed muffled. Men huddled beneath makeshift tarps, water dripping down helmets, rifles resting across their knees. Lightning illuminated trees stripped bare by recent fire, turning them into white skeletons etched against the sky. The jungle breathed around them alive, unpredictable, indifferent. Some soldiers whispered that in such nights the forest felt older than war itself, as though it were simply observing the conflict with slow, patient eyes. For North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, the burned sections of forest became pathways. Without the cover of thick canopy, they moved cautiously, but they adapted quickly. They dug shallow trenches in exposed ground, moved at night, and memorized new routes created by the destruction. They learned to position themselves just beyond the edges of burned zones, blending into intact foliage. From those positions, they launched sudden attacks that vanished into the darkness as quickly as they began. For American and South Vietnamese troops, adapting meant developing new tactics. They trained to move in staggered formations, scanning trees for snipers, checking overhead branches for hidden traps. They learned to decipher smells, the scent of smoke from a recently extinguished cooking fire, the faint trace of gun oil, even perfume clinging to the leaves from women who had passed through hours before carrying supplies. The jungle told stories to those who listened, though not always in time to prevent danger. But amid all this, there were moments of stillness that contrasted sharply with the violence. In the early mornings, mist lingered low across the charred ground, softening the harsh outlines of destruction. Birds returned quickly, perching on blackened branches and calling across the silence as if reclaiming their territory. Young soldiers, exhausted from days of tension, sometimes paused to watch this quiet rebirth. It reminded them that the land, though scarred, would outlive the conflict. Yet the worst moments came when fire and ambush collided. One unit described walking through an area recently scorched by napalm when the ground suddenly erupted with gunfire. Smoke still hung in the air, making it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. Shadows flickered between the tree stumps, enemy fighters using the cover of swirling ash and lingering heat. Gunfire cracked and popped, mixing with the hiss of smouldering roots. The smell of burned earth clung to uniforms, and soldiers shouted commands that were swallowed by the thick smoke. It was a battle fought in half visibility, where shapes moved like phantoms, and every tree could hide danger. Encounters like this taught both sides that the war had entered a new phase. The jungle could no longer be understood simply as terrain. It had become an unpredictable force that shaped combat itself. Fire exposed enemies, but also created new hiding places. Ambushes tested nerves as much as training. And the vanishing foe, always present, never fully seen, remained a constant reminder that the conflict was not just physical, but psychological. As the months passed, the rainforest bore the marks of fire, traps, and desperate fights. But it also remained alive, regrowing, reshaping, reclaiming. Soldiers walked through landscapes both ravaged and reborn, carrying with them the knowledge that in this war the jungle was never passive. It watched, concealed, revealed, and transformed shield and trap in equal measure. The villages seemed so small on the maps, tiny symbols tucked between winding rivers and the dark green blocks that marked the jungle. But for the people who lived there, they were whole worlds. Clusters of wooden homes on stilts, patches of rice paddies shining pale under the sun, dirt paths worn smooth by generations of footsteps. These were places built on routine. Early morning markets, children chasing each other barefoot, farmers tending fields that their parents and grandparents had once tended, and for a long time, the distant thunder of conflict felt like something happening elsewhere, drifting in from the edges of the horizon like an approaching storm that might never arrive. But storms always arrive eventually. The war crept into these villages first as rumours. Travellers passing through spoke of new checkpoints along the roads, of soldiers moving north or south, of treks through jungles darkened by smoke. Many villagers listened with anxious curiosity, the way one listens to stories about faraway troubles. They kept their routines, though with more careful glances toward the tree line. But as months passed, the rumours sharpened into reality. Distant explosions at night, columns of dust rising from the next valley, helicopters drawing lines across the sky like metal insects. Even the animals sensed something shifting. Buffaloes grew restless. Chickens scattered at unfamiliar vibrations in the air. Villagers found themselves caught between forces far beyond their control. North Vietnamese soldiers passed through quietly, asking for food but leaving little trace. South Vietnamese troops arrived in trucks, checking papers and asking stern questions. And eventually, American patrols entered as well, helmeted silhouettes moving through the paddies with cautious steps. Many villagers didn't speak the soldiers' languages, so interactions relied on gestures. Open palms to show no threat, nods toward the well, pointing fingers toward trails leading into the jungle. One mainstream fact often overlooked is that the majority of Vietnam's population at the time lived in rural areas, and their lives were shaped less by ideology than by survival. They were farmers before the war, and most wanted nothing more than to remain farmers. But when armies moved through, neutrality became dangerous. Offer rice to one side, and the other might accuse you of aiding the enemy. Refuse, and you might face consequences from the soldiers standing in front of you. It was a daily balancing act, with risks on every side. As pressure grew, small disruptions added up. Roads became unreliable. parents kept children home from school on days when artillery rumbled too loudly. Nighttime, once a peaceful curtain of insects and lantern glow, grew tense. Families blew out candles earlier, not wanting to draw attention. They whispered more, laughed less. Even the gentle clink of bowls during dinner seemed too loud. One older woman in a northern hamlet liked to joke lightly, gently, the way villagers sometimes teased hardship that the war had made her rooster confused. "He crows at the wrong times," she said. "He can't tell the difference between a sunrise and a flare." Her neighbours chuckled at her small joke, even as they shared the uneasy truth behind it. Bright lights often streaked across the sky at night, confusing not only animals but people too. And once in a while, the flares weren't followed by silence, but by something far worse. There was a fringe tidbit many outsiders have never heard. Some villagers believed that the jungle itself was keeping score of all who passed through. Not in a mystical way, necessarily, but in a practical sense. Paths once clear became overgrown when troops used them too often. Birds that usually sang at dawn fell silent before patrols appeared. Water buffalo grew skittish when armed men approached. Whether or not the forest truly kept track, many villagers trusted such signs more than official news broadcasts. As battles intensified, villages sometimes found themselves suddenly in the crossfire. A unit might pursue enemies through the fields, and the air would erupt with panic. Families dove under their stilted homes, covering their ears as gunfire cracked through the bamboo walls. The scent of smoke drifted in. Some families fled temporarily into the jungle, carrying little more than a pot, a blanket, and a few handfuls of rice. They returned days later to find bullet holes in their doors or a collapsed roof where a stray mortar had landed. A peaceful life could be undone in minutes. Historians still argue whether civilian displacement during these years was driven more by military strategies, fear of reprisals, or simple exhaustion. But whatever the reason, many villages emptied and filled again, like tides, people leaving, returning, leaving once more, struggling to preserve some sense of normalcy. Schools were among the hardest places to maintain. Teachers taught when they could, stopping lessons abruptly when aircraft roared overhead. Sometimes they moved classes outdoors, away from buildings that felt too fragile. Children learned multiplication tables under banana trees, their notebooks spotted with humidity. Some days there were only a few students present. Some days none came at all. One teacher later recalled that she measured peace not by treaties, but by how many children were brave enough to show up for reading lessons. And yet, even in these difficult times, life insisted on continuing. Weddings took place quietly, with smaller feasts. Farmers repaired dikes washed out by floods. Women wove baskets at dusk while keeping one ear tuned to the distant hills. Families lit kerosene lamps in the evenings, though they shielded the windows with cloth so the glow wouldn't travel too far. Communities shared what they had: rice, sweet potatoes, news. Many had little choice but to become resourceful, storing food in places soldiers wouldn't look, planting small hidden gardens behind bamboo fences, keeping emergency bundles under the floorboards in case evacuation came suddenly. Sometimes soldiers camped nearby, and villagers offered water or directions out of politeness and fear combined. On rare occasions, troops helped rebuild a damaged wall or carried an injured child to a medic. These small moments of humanity stayed with villagers for years, standing out sharply against the darker memories of conflict. A South Vietnamese soldier lifting a fallen palm frond from a farmer's path. An American medic giving candy to a group of curious children, unaware that the children would later trade jokes about how strange it tasted. A North Vietnamese fighter slipping a scarf to a grandmother who shivered in the early morning cold. Even laughter found its place. Children played games in bomb craters after the danger had passed, splashing in puddles like it was nothing unusual. Young men teased each other about who could carry the heaviest sacks of rice. Old men told stories at dusk, leaning on bamboo staffs, recounting tales older than any political slogan. These small sparks of normal life kept spirits alive. But beneath all this resilience lay an unspoken truth. The villages were being squeezed. The jungle, once a protective boundary, now carried the echoes of marching feet. Farmland, which depended on predictable planting cycles, became unpredictable. Nights were no longer entirely safe, nor entirely dark, and the soft lantern light that once warmed the edges of each home now flickered more nervously. In the end, what defined these years for villagers was not a single moment of catastrophe, but the slow erosion of certainty. They learned to live between armies, between ideologies, between fear and hope. They woke each morning thankful for quiet, yet aware that the next explosion, far or near, could send ripples through their lives again. Still, they endured. Fields continued to grow. Children continued to dream. Families continued to hold each other close in the deepening night, listening not only to the distant explosions, but to the soft sounds of their world trying, stubbornly, to survive. The trails were never meant to carry the weight they eventually bore. They began as narrow footpaths, winding through thick forests and high mountain passes, used by villagers, hunters, and traders long before the war gave them a new purpose. But once the conflict deepened, those same paths became arteries, vital, dangerous, endlessly travelled. They stretched from the north, curled through Laos and Cambodia, and flowed into the south like a network of hidden veins. And together they formed what would later be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. To the Vietnamese who walked it, the trail wasn't a single road, but a world of routes, detours, and secret spaces. Some stretches were wide enough for bicycles or trucks when the weather cooperated. Others were little more than slippery ledges along cliffs where one misstep meant a fall into darkness. Rain could erase footprints within minutes. Fog descended without warning, turning the mountains into a labyrinth. And yet, day after day, people moved along this network, young men, young women, seasoned soldiers, and quiet couriers carrying messages that sometimes weighed more than the supplies in their packs. The first thing travellers learned was to trust their senses. The jungle along the trail could be strangely silent at times, as if listening. The air changed subtly when aircraft approached, even before the engines were audible. A faint vibration passed through the leaves. Birds went quiet. Couriers paused mid-step, eyes scanning upward. Many claimed they could feel danger in the way the wind shifted. Whether or not that was entirely true didn't matter. Perception often meant survival. One mainstream historical fact is that the Ho Chi Minh Trail moved tens of thousands of troops and immense quantities of supplies over the years, despite the relentless bombings meant to destroy it. It wasn't a single trail, but an adaptable, ever-changing system. If a path was bombed, workers rebuilt it overnight, or simply carved around the damage. Bridges were woven from bamboo. Truck engines were muffled with cloth. People travelled under the canopy, rarely in open sunlight. But numbers don't capture the lived experience, the sound of boots on wet soil, the slap of leaves against packed bamboo frames, the exhausting mix of mud, sweat, and determination. Couriers were among the most remarkable figures on the trail. Some were barely teenagers, carrying letters or reports tucked inside waterproof tins strapped close to their chests. They walked for days or weeks, without stopping near villages, avoiding places marked as too exposed. Their loads weren't heavy, but they carried secrets that could change entire operations. Out on the trail, they encountered everything. Snakes curled on branches, abandoned campsites still warm from recent fires, bomb craters filled with rainwater, reflecting the canopy like mirrors. Many couriers travelled in small groups, whispering quietly as they moved. The older ones taught the younger how to walk without snapping twigs, how to read the colour of disturbed earth, how to distinguish between the hum of insects and the distant drone of aircraft. At night, they slept in hammocks tied high above the ground, swaying gently like leaves. If they dreamed, the jungle swallowed the sound. A fringe tidbit known among some veterans is that certain couriers believed specific trees acted like guardians, large, twisted trunks that marked safe resting spots. These trees, they said, never fell to bombs despite many near misses. Whether superstition or coincidence, people shared stories of these resilient giants, using them as landmarks in a land where most landmarks could be burned or buried within days. Hidden camps were scattered along the trail like beads on a string. Some were deep underground hollowed chambers, reinforced with logs, with smoke from cooking fires, carefully filtered through long bamboo tubes that released it far from camp. Others were simple depressions covered by woven leaf mats. Travellers entered at night, greeted by the smell of rice, porridge and herbs. People mended sandals, patched uniforms, sharpened tools. A pot simmered quietly, sending out a familiar aroma that softened the edges of exhaustion. In these camps, soldiers shared stories of home. One man described the sound of waves against the shore near his village. Another spoke of his mother's soup, thick with sweet potato. Someone might pull out a cheap mouth organ and play a tune that drifted softly through the huts until a lookout whispered, "Airplane," and the notes faded instantly. Those moments, brief and fragile, gave shape to life on the trail. Historians still argue whether the resilience of the Ho Chi Minh Trail came primarily from its engineering, the tenacity of its travellers, or the constant improvisation of those who maintained it. But those who walked it often say it was all three. If one element weakened, the others compensated. The bombings were relentless. The sky could grow darker at midday as planes swooped low, dropping payloads that shook the mountains. Travellers felt explosions through their ribs, as though the earth were speaking in violent bursts. Afterward, dust settled like fine ash, coating leaves, boots, and hair. People waited in silence, counting breaths before emerging to assess damage. Then the work began. Trail workers, many of them women, cleared debris, filled craters with packed soil, rebuilt bamboo bridges. They sang softly as they worked, voices carrying just above the rustle of branches. Some nights, the moonlit mountains flickered with fireflies dancing over newly mended curves of path. There were darker moments too. A sudden ambush, a landslide after heavy rain, a unit separated during fog, wandering for hours in terrain that twisted endlessly. A group that stumbled onto a crater, still warm, smoke rising like a ghost. People learned to travel with caution, not fear. Fear made footsteps clumsy. Sometimes unexpected kindness emerged along the trail. Villagers, living near the routes, risked reprisals by offering water or fruit to passing travellers. Children waved shyly, handing over bundles of sticky rice wrapped in banana leaves. One soldier, years later, remembered an old man who offered him a place to rest under a bamboo hut during a storm. "The rain fell so hard I thought the sky would break," he recalled. "But he poured me tea and told me that storms always pass, even if they take their time." These gestures lingered in memory, defying the harshness of the journey. Nights on the trail were some of the most haunting in the entire war. Fog drifted between tree trunks. Moths fluttered around dim lamps. Men and women sat quietly, listening to distant booms echoing across valleys. The trail seemed both endless and intimate, stretching across countries yet contained entirely within the rhythm of footsteps and breath. Some travellers said the mountains carried voices. On still nights, echoes of explosions or distant calls bounced between cliffs, making it impossible to tell where the sounds originated. Others believed the forest itself whispered warnings, branches creaking softly just before danger, birds erupting from trees moments before a patrol approached. Whether myth or instinct, those who survived often said that the trail taught them to pay attention to everything. By the time they reached their destinations, many travellers felt transformed. Their clothes were torn, their packs lighter, their feet blistered. But they arrived carrying not just supplies or messages, but stories etched into their memories. The hidden camps, the mountain passes, the endless perseverance, and the knowledge that life along the Ho Chi Minh Trail pulsed like a heartbeat, steady, fragile, and vital to everything that came next. Thunder does not always come from clouds. Sometimes it rises from decisions made in quiet rooms, from signals half heard over radio static, from the sudden crackle of an encounter at sea. Long before headlines screamed about escalation, long before the United States committed fully to the war, the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin shimmered under a heavy dusk, holding within them the spark that would ignite a much fiercer storm. The Gulf itself seemed deceptively calm in early August. Fishing boats drifted lazily across the waves. Carved wooden hulls creaked softly as men reeled in nets heavy with the night's catch. Lighthouses blinked, marking a shoreline where the mountains fell sharply into the sea. To villagers on the coast, the ocean was simply a place to earn a living. Dangerous, yes, but familiar. Yet just beyond the sight of lanterns and bobbing boats, sleek metal hulls moved like shadows, bristling with antennas and radars, carrying sailors who had travelled thousands of miles to be there. Months earlier, whispers of tension filtered through military corridors. Patrol routes were drawn, intelligence reports stacked up, and discussions stretched late into the night. The Cold War was a long chess match, and Vietnam, for better or for worse, had become a board where each move carried global consequences. Surveillance missions intensified. The U.S. Navy's destroyers, with their humming machinery and disciplined crews, traced quiet paths along the Gulf, gathering information while keeping an eye on the coastline. Onshore, radio operators in North Vietnam monitored signals of these patrols, their headphones crackling with every coded pulse. Reports were handed to commanders who studied maps under dim lights, aware that each passing American vessel signaled a growing international presence. Fishermen returning to small harbours sometimes mentioned glimpsing large ships far out in the mist. Villagers overheard soldiers discussing increased vigilance and patrols. The tension was not yet visible, but it lived like a shadow at the edge of every conversation. Then came the first encounter. The sea was restless that day, small waves slapping at the sides of the American destroyer as lookouts scanned the waters. From the deck, the coastline appeared as a faint smudge across the horizon. Suddenly, dots appeared on the radar, small, fast, closing in, patrol boats, sleek, narrow, and moving with purpose. Warnings crackled through the ship. Sailors hurried to stations. Engines roared on both sides. Spray rose as the distances collapsed. Shots were fired. Not many, and the details would later be debated: who shot first, how many boats, whether it was an attack or a misinterpretation of movements in choppy water. But on the deck of that destroyer, with adrenaline pumping and metal reverberating under each thundering moment, the specifics mattered far less than the feeling. Conflict had touched the open sea. The encounter ended quickly. The patrol boats withdrew, and the destroyer resumed its path. But the story had already begun to travel. Reports raced back across the ocean, passing through secure channels, landing on the desks of advisors and presidents. Meetings followed. Strategy sessions multiplied. In Washington, the incident was more than a clash of small vessels. It was a signal that something was shifting, that the boundaries of the conflict were widening. Meanwhile, on the shores of Vietnam, the event rippled through coastal communities. Some villagers saw smoke in the distance and wondered what it meant. Others noticed an increase in military traffic on the roads leading to nearby bases. Action and preparation accelerated. In the jungles far inland, soldiers who had never seen the sea began hearing rumors of American warships engaging Vietnamese boats. To them, the Gulf felt impossibly far away, yet the consequences of that clash drifted through the canopy like a distant storm front. 2 nights later, uncertainty grew thicker. Radar operators aboard the American destroyer reported new contacts, fast-moving objects approaching. Lightning flashed far off across the Gulf. The waves were high, fog drifting low. Orders snapped through the ship. Be ready. Engines rumbled, men braced, communications buzzed. Some sailors felt the electrifying rush of imminent danger. Others felt a knot in their stomachs, sensing confusion in the reports, even as alarms sounded. What happened next would become one of the most fiercely debated moments in modern military history. Torpedoes were reported multiple, streaking through the dark sea. Or perhaps they weren't torpedoes at all. Radar blips, bouncing signals, churning waves, sudden movements in bad weather, everything blurred together. But in the heat of the moment, with instruments flashing and adrenaline surging, the interpretation was clear to those on board. They were under attack. The destroyer maneuvered sharply. Gunfire lit the night. Messages shot across networks, carrying urgent descriptions of threats and evasive actions. The crew moved in coordinated precision, every shout drowned beneath the roar of machinery and the pounding of the sea. Even as conflicting signals emerged, the narrative solidified. Hostile boats had attacked. In Washington, the reports arrived without the chaos attached to them. They arrived as text, as radio transmissions, as distilled summaries. And with them came momentum. Policymakers saw not ambiguity, but escalation. The president convened emergency meetings. Advisors argued, weighed, discussed. Within days, resolutions were drafted. The halls of Congress echoed as legislators debated the necessity of responding firmly, decisively. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution followed broad, powerful, and transformative. It granted authority to expand military involvement, to send more troops, more aircraft, more resources into a conflict that had, until then, been limited. The thunder that began over the Gulf now rumbled across continents, shaping the trajectory of a war that countless young men and women would soon find themselves pulled into. Back in Vietnam, the effects unfolded quietly at first. Farmers in Mekong Delta fields noticed new aircraft passing overhead. Soldiers along rural posts received updated briefings hinting at larger operations to come. Young recruits on both sides, many barely adults, heard through rumour and whispered conversations that the war was entering a new phase, one that would reshape entire regions. In the villages along the coast, fishermen still cast their nets, but now they did so with wary eyes on the horizon. The Gulf's waters no longer felt simply like a provider of livelihoods. They felt like a doorway through which foreign powers could enter. Nights grew louder with the thrum of engines. New command posts sprang up near old docks. And across the jungle, The faint mechanical hum of helicopters occasionally drifted on the wind, signalling the first arrival of a much larger American presence. What began as a clash at sea had become a turning point on land. The jungle would soon feel the weight of boots and bombs that no one on that quiet shoreline could have imagined. But all of it, the escalation, the mobilization, the deepening conflict, could be traced back to those tense August nights when the sea flickered with flashes of fear and misinterpretation, and lightning far off on the horizon masked a gathering storm that would engulf an entire nation. Dawn came softly at first, brushing the treetops with pale gold, but the light never reached the ground. The canopy swallowed it, turning the world below into a dim green twilight. Birds called, roosters crowed from distant villages, and for a brief moment the land seemed unchanged, quiet, breathing, ancient. No one knew yet that the day would bring a new kind of thunder, one that did not wait for storms or clouds. Word had begun to spread days earlier, not through radios or newspapers, but through the murmuring chain of soldiers returning from short leave, of villagers walking the dusty roads, of travellers who passed along the edges of bases. American aircraft were increasing their flights. More supply trucks rumbled across bridges. More fuel barrels appeared stacked like metal towers near airfields. Something was coming, something larger than anything before. What no one saw were the rooms far away where decisions were made. Strategy meetings with maps pinned on the walls, red arrows stretching across the shape of Vietnam, charts listing targets with cold precision. Operation Rolling Thunder, a name chosen to sound decisive, powerful, unstoppable. It promised to be months of coordinated airstrikes, a demonstration of force meant to pressure leaders in the north and protect the south. On paper, it was lines and targets. In the sky, it would be storms of metal. Morning in the countryside always began with sounds, the thud of pestles grinding rice, children laughing on the way to the river, cattle lowing as they were led to fields. But on that morning, another sound intruded, faint at first, like a swarm of distant insects, then louder, a vibrating pulse that made leaves tremble. Dogs barked, women looked up from their work. Soldiers along jungle paths froze as the air itself seemed to tighten. From beyond the horizon, aircraft emerged, dozens of them. Their silver bodies glinted faintly in the sunlight before fading into dark silhouettes. They flew in tight formations, wings slicing through the sky with purpose. The roar built into a wall of noise, shaking branches, rattling thatch roofs, causing even the rivers to shiver in their beds. For many villagers, it was their first time seeing planes so large, so numerous. Some stared upward in confusion. Others, remembering earlier raids, grabbed their children and ran for shallow trenches or hastily dug shelters. A few simply stood still, unable to look away from the sky, as if witnessing something unreal. Then the first explosions fell. The sound was not a single boom but a rolling wave, crashing outward like a monstrous heartbeat. The ground convulsed, soil leapt into the air, birds erupted from the trees in panicked clouds. Smoke pillars twisted upward as burning leaves fluttered down like black snow. In the jungle, soldiers from both sides pressed against the earth, gripping their rifles as though they could anchor themselves to stability. Some had heard of American bombers from earlier conflicts, Korea, Europe, but hearing about them and experiencing them were not the same thing. The air itself felt like it was being torn apart. The sky glowed with streaks of falling ordnance, each burst clearing entire sections of foliage. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Ancient trunks that had stood through centuries of storms toppled in seconds. Vines swung violently in the shockwaves. The earth, rich with roots and hidden tunnels, buckled and heaved. At a small outpost deep in the forest, a group of young North Vietnamese soldiers crouched inside a camouflaged bunker. The doorway quivered as each explosion drew closer. They had been trained for hardship, for marches through mud and rain, for hunger and exhaustion. But nothing prepared them for fire that fell from the heavens. Still, they did what they had been taught. They stayed low, they steadied each other, and they reminded themselves that the jungle had protected their ancestors for generations. If it could not protect them from this, nothing could. Across the border, at American bases, mechanics and pilots moved in coordinated rhythms. Crews fueled aircraft, checked engines, loaded bombs, and mapped flight paths with practiced speed. Pilots sat silently in small rooms, reviewing photographs of targets and listening to briefings that reduced villages, bridges, and roads to military objectives. Many of them were barely out of college. Some believed the bombings would shorten the war. Others felt a knot in their stomachs each time they strapped into the cockpit. The roar of takeoff filled the runways all day. Jets climbed into the sky, leaving trails of heat shimmering behind them. When they returned hours later, their wings empty, crews swarmed to ready them again. It was a relentless cycle, machines rising, fire falling, smoke spreading. Back in the countryside, the air smelled of burning rubber, fuel, and charred wood. Villagers moved carefully among the ruins of their fields. Water buffalo wandered nervously through broken fences. Craters, wide as houses, dotted the land like fresh scars. A small group of children huddled behind their mother as she tried to calm them, her voice trembling despite her efforts. Nights had once been filled with the chirping of crickets and the gentle hum of the forest. Now, even after the plains were gone, the world seemed too quiet, as if stunned by what it had endured. In the highlands, along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, couriers paused in mid-journey, waiting for the bombardment to pass. They pressed themselves against boulders as the blasts rolled over the mountains like furious drums. Many of the trails were cut by craters now. Bridges that had been built overnight by teams of workers lay scattered in smoking pieces. And yet, as soon as the planes left, men and women emerged to repair the paths, driven by a determination that no amount of fire from above could extinguish. Even American soldiers stationed far from the strikes felt the earth quiver. Some stood on the edges of their bases, watching distant clouds of smoke rising over the treetops. They knew the purpose of the operation, understood the strategy, believed the official explanations, but they also understood anyone could see that each wave of bombs altered the land in ways impossible to reverse. As days turned to weeks, and weeks into months, the sound of engines overhead became a constant presence. For some, it meant protection. For others, destruction. But for everyone, it meant that the war had grown larger, heavier, more consuming. Rolling thunder was not a single storm, but a season long, bruising and merciless. The sky could no longer be trusted, the ground no longer felt solid, villages rebuilt only to be shaken again. Soldiers adapted, digging deeper shelters, moving under thicker foliage, learning to read the rhythms of the bombing runs. Civilians whispered prayers before sleep, hoping that the next wave would pass over them. By the time dusk arrived each day, the horizon was often lined with haze, tinted orange by burning fields and smouldering trees. The sun seemed duller, its light filtered through curtains of smoke. Nights returned, but they no longer brought peace, only the lingering echoes of engines, the memory of fire, and the knowledge that tomorrow the sky might open again. Fire had come from above, and nothing in Vietnam, jungle, village, soldier, or sky would ever be the same. Lanterns flickered long before the sun fully rose, their soft glow marking early stirrings in cities that tried every day to pretend the war lived somewhere else. Saigon woke first, as it usually did. Motorbikes coughed to life, vendors arranged baskets of fruit, and the smell of fresh banh mi drifted through narrow alleys where children chased each other between stacked crates. At a distance, helicopters thudded like slow, tired insects. But in the streets below, life pushed forward with a determined kind of stubbornness. People had learned to hold fear in one hand and routine in the other. Street lamps still glowed faintly as morning dark softened. A few soldiers sipped iced coffee at sidewalk stalls, their uniforms wrinkled, boots dusty. They watched the city quietly, trying to convince themselves the day would stay calm. Across the street, a group of students walked towards school, books tucked under their arms, hair carefully combed. Their laughter sounded almost normal, though every now and then one of them would glance upward, checking the sky the same way a fisherman checks tides. In cafes along Tudo Street, ceiling fans turned lazily. Foreign correspondents leafed through notebooks, while locals gossiped about rising prices, fuel shortages, or rumours of new offensives. Nobody ever claimed to know the whole truth. The war was too large, too twisting. Still, everyone listened, everyone worried, and everyone kept buying coffee. Somehow, sitting together with a strong cup made the city feel less fragile. Hugh woke more slowly, its ancient walls holding on to the coolness of night. Lanterns here weren't decorations. They were habits, soft floating lights, strung between homes, across narrow bridges, and in front of small family shrines. People swept their doorsteps with long bamboo brooms, pausing when distant artillery rumbled like muted thunder. The perfume river flowed as calmly as ever, reflecting fragments of pink sunrise on its surface. Fishermen pushed off in slender boats, paddling quietly through drifting morning mist. Life in Hue felt gentler, but also more brittle. Everyone knew how close the fighting sometimes came. It was a city of scholars, artists, and ancestors, a place where history hung in the air like incense. And yet it lived beside front lines that shifted without warning. Some residents whispered that the tranquility felt borrowed, temporary. Historians still argue whether Ho, with all its cultural importance, was ever truly protected or simply waiting for the tides of conflict to sweep through. Far to the north, Da Nang buzzed with a different rhythm. It had become a crucial hub, filled with supply trucks, ships, and American units rotating in and out. The harbour glittered with metal hulls. The roads pulsed with movement. Near the beach, soldiers lined up at makeshift bars, trying to forget the jungle for a night or two. In the markets, women in conical hats arranged fish, still shimmering with seawater. Children sold lottery tickets, weaving between crowds with rehearsed boldness. Though the city hummed with activity, uncertainty lingered like humidity. Loudspeakers crackled with announcements urging calm. Military convoys passed often, their engines growling through civilian neighbourhoods. At night, the lights of Da Nang spread across the coastline, but just beyond those bright clusters lay stretches of darkness where the war grew thick again. Saigon's days drifted in layered contradictions. New hotels went up. Tailors continued taking measurements for foreign visitors. Radios played sentimental ballads about distant lovers or uncertain futures. And yet, checkpoints tightened. Patrols increased. Posters urging unity or vigilance appeared overnight on walls that had been blank the day before. The city glimmered in daylight and trembled in shadow. One quirky detail visitors often noticed was the way power outages shaped evening routines. When lights abruptly went dark, which happened often, people didn't panic. They simply lit candles or adjusted lantern wicks, calling out to neighbours to make sure everyone was all right. It became such a normal part of life that children sometimes turned the outages into games, pretending the city had been swallowed by a giant, quiet creature who could only be chased away by laughter. Parents let them believe it. Hope mattered. In Hue, evening lanterns transformed the streets into ribbons of warm gold. People gathered near food stalls, selling bowls of steaming boonbor. Couples walked along the riverbank, hands lightly touching but eyes drifting to the horizon whenever a distant boom echoed. Temples glowed in soft illumination, inviting prayers for safety, for peace, for strength. The old citadel, massive and dignified, stood like a sleeping guardian, though even its ancient stones could not promise protection. Da Nang's nights were louder, the bars near the airbase filled with music, clinking glasses, and conversations shouted over competing speakers. Soldiers laughed too hard, danced too energetically, spoke too quickly, as if rushing to feel something before returning to patrols or missions. Local vendors set up late-night food carts, grilling skewers that released delicious waves of smoke. Some soldiers tried the fiery sauces and instantly regretted it, coughing and laughing as their friends teased them. Even in wartime, losing a battle against chili peppers was fair game for jokes. But when the music faded and the crowds thinned, the deeper quiet returned. Everyone felt it, that shared awareness that the world outside the cities was burning. Rumours travelled faster than official reports. Villages evacuated, convoys ambushed, new troop movements underway. And still, every morning, people rose again. Markets opened. Schools rang their bells. The sea breeze moved through Da Nang like a soft reassurance. Even in Saigon, where cafes glowed late into the night, people sensed the pressure building. Bombings in nearby provinces sent ripples of fear through the capital. Families debated whether to send children away to relatives in quieter areas. Shopkeepers stocked goods nervously, wondering what the next month would bring. And yet, as one cafe owner liked to say, "If the coffee still tastes good, the day isn't lost." It was his simple philosophy, and somehow it helped. The tension that blanketed the cities didn't suffocate them. It wove itself into their identity. They became places where survival meant maintaining fragments of the familiar lanterns, markets, festivals, morning prayer chants. Every gesture of normalcy felt like a small victory. People learned to live in two realities at once: the world of everyday life and the world of a war that refused to stay outside city limits. Soldiers passing through carried these impressions with them. They remembered the lanterns glowing over Hue's bridges, the motorcycles weaving through Saigon traffic, the salty breeze of Da Nang's shore. These memories travelled back to bases, to letters home, to quiet evenings before deployment. They reminded some that Vietnam was more than jungles and gunfire. It was full of people holding on to hope with a tenderness that surprised them. As night deepened across all three cities, lanterns shone like small, stubborn stars. The war pressed in from every direction, but the cities still breathed cautiously, bravely, beautifully. And under those lantern lights, life flickered on, refusing to be extinguished. Night had always been a time of comfort across Vietnam, a time for quiet dinners, shared stories, and the soft glow of lanterns swaying in warm breezes. But on the eve of the Lunar New Year, known as Tet, the calm felt unusually deep. Families placed fruit trays before altars, lit incense sticks whose smoke curled like gentle prayers, and welcomed spirits of ancestors with songs, laughter, and small fireworks that crackled harmlessly over courtyards. Even soldiers on both sides expected a temporary stillness. Tet was sacred, a moment when fighting traditionally paused and the country breathed together. In Saigon, the evening before the holiday felt almost peaceful. Firecrackers snapped along alleys. Children ran in festive clothes, their pockets stuffed with red envelopes and sweets. Vendors sold sugar-coated fruits beside stalls, offering paper decorations shaped like carp and peach blossoms. Homes filled with the aroma of sticky rice cakes simmering in large pots, a scent that wrapped whole neighborhoods in warmth. If a helicopter passed overhead, people barely looked up. They were too busy preparing for one of the most cherished celebrations of the year. Hue, with its imperial history, glowed with ceremonial grace. Lanterns floated on the perfume river, drifting slowly toward the sea like small blessings. Temples hummed with quiet chants. Even soldiers stationed near the city allowed themselves a moment of tenderness, writing letters or polishing boots for the next day's festivities. No one imagined that the night itself was a fragile illusion, a thin veil stretched over something waiting in the dark. Da Nang sparkled with lantern light and ocean breeze. American soldiers traded gifts with local vendors, bought silk scarves to send home, and took photographs with friends, hoping to capture a rare moment of calm. Some joked that even the war needed a holiday, if only they knew how close that joke was to shattering. Just past midnight, the world shifted. At first, the sounds blended with the lingering noise of firecrackers, a few pops, a distant crack. People smiled, thinking children were still awake. But then the rhythm changed. The soft pops became bursts. The bursts became sharp explosions. Windows rattled. In Saigon's outskirts, dogs began barking in frantic waves. The air tightened in a way that instinct recognized before reason did. The Tet offensive began. Across the country, in more than 100 towns, cities, military bases, and outposts, coordinated attacks erupted almost simultaneously. Soldiers who had been relaxing for the holiday jolted awake to gunfire erupting from alleys, rooftops, riverbanks. Civilians leapt from beds as mortar shells screamed overhead. The holiday fireworks were drowned beneath real ones. In Saigon, the first hours felt unreal. Gunfire echoed down normally lively streets, turning market corners into battlegrounds. Groups of Viet Cong fighters slipped through the city's shadows, using Tet decorations as makeshift cover. Smoke rose from the direction of the presidential palace as defenders scrambled to respond. At the American embassy, one of the most secure buildings in the city, attackers blew through the outer wall, sending shockwaves through both the city and the watching world. Though they never captured the building, the very image of fighters breaching its gates travelled farther than any bullet could. In Hue, the transformation was even more devastating. The ancient city, with its citadel walls and imperial tombs, became a maze of fierce combat. Soldiers and civilians alike fled through narrow alleys as gunfire erupted from hidden positions. Families who had been preparing Tet offerings only hours earlier now crouched beneath shattered windows, whispering prayers no one could hear over the roar of battle. Days later, Her would become one of the most contested and tragic sights of the entire war. Its quiet beauty scarred in ways that historians still argue whether the city ever fully recovered from. But on that first night, few could think beyond survival. In Da Nang, alarms blared across bases as rockets shattered the celebratory calm. Soldiers scrambled into defensive positions, some still wearing festive hats from a party they'd left behind moments earlier. The enemy struck with speed and precision, testing every perimeter. Even those far from the city's centre felt the thud of explosions along the perimeter of the airbase. Back in Saigon, chaos and confusion twisted through the city. Streets normally filled with Tet lanterns became paths for fleeing civilians. A woman who had been preparing a holiday feast now shielded her children against a concrete wall, whispering promises she hoped she could keep. A group of monks ushered families into a temple, lighting candles not for celebration but for guidance through fear. American and South Vietnamese radio operators struggled to keep pace with the avalanche of reports. The scale of the attacks stunned them. It wasn't one battle, or even a dozen. It was everywhere, a coordinated strike that defied previous assumptions. Analysts in Washington stared at maps filling with red markers. Correspondents scribbled frantically into notebooks, realizing the story unfolding was far larger than they had ever anticipated. In the jungle, where the scent of gunpowder mixed with crushed leaves, units moved carefully through paths illuminated only by sporadic flares. Some soldiers joked nervously that Tet had certainly delivered surprises this year, trying to ease the tension. Humor, as usual, arrived awkwardly, but helped keep panic at bay. The truth, though, felt heavier. The enemy was stronger, more prepared, and more determined than many had believed. One fringe detail whispered among troops was how fighters had hidden weapons inside coffins during the holiday, a tactic both cunning and unsettling. Some swore it was true, others doubted it, and historians still argue whether this detail was fact or rumour amplified by the shock of the offensive. But in a night as chaotic as this one, nearly anything felt possible. By sunrise, smoke curled over rooftops where lanterns still hung, torn, or half-burned. Streets were scattered with fallen Tet decorations, as if the holiday itself had shattered alongside the city's sense of safety. Soldiers moved in cautious formations, checking buildings one room at a time. Civilians peeked through cracks in shutters, searching for signs that the worst had passed. News of the offensive spread beyond Vietnam with lightning speed. Television screens in living rooms across America showed images of burning buildings, frightened civilians, and intense street fighting. The contrast between official claims of progress and the reality of the Tet attacks shook viewers deeply. Many began questioning the war, wondering how a conflict described as nearing victory could suddenly erupt with such force. Public perception changed almost overnight. Back in Hue, the Perfume River carried fallen lanterns downstream, their small flames extinguished by the water. In Saigon, temples opened their doors to shelter families who could not return home. Da Nang patched its runways and prepared for the next wave. Tet had always been a celebration of renewal, of families, ancestors, and hope. But that year, the holiday became something else entirely. A night when the war revealed its full, unforgiving weight. The dawn that followed felt different across Vietnam, because everyone now understood that the conflict had entered a new, darker chapter, one that could no longer be ignored, dismissed, or explained away as distant. The weeks following the Tet Offensive settled over Vietnam like a long, uneven breath, one part disbelief, one part grim acceptance, and another part quiet reckoning. The shock had not faded, it had only sunk deeper, like water seeping into soil after a sudden storm. Villages that had once measured time by the rhythm of the harvest now measured it by the crack of distant gunfire and the slow rebuilding of shattered doorframes. Cities that had watched fireworks in celebration now stared out at streets still scarred by the flashes of combat. And everywhere, from the Mekong Delta to the mountains near the Laotian border, people walked their footsteps soft, heavy, or unsure across land marked by ash. In the countryside, farmers moved through fields that had been scorched or pitted by explosions, carrying baskets and tools with an air of weary determination. Their rice paddies had become strange mosaics, patches of green surviving among blackened earth. Water buffalo dragged ploughs through mud that still smelled faintly of smoke. Each day felt like a negotiation with the land. What could still grow here? What might sprout again if given time? And though many would say nothing ever truly returned to how it was, still they rose before dawn to try, because life demanded it, quietly and relentlessly. In small hamlets nearby, elders sat beneath bent palm roofs, speaking in low tones about the offensive. To them, Tet had always meant renewal, an opening for blessings, reunions, and warm laughter. But this year, they said, Tet had been split in two. The old Tet, filled with ceremonial incense and spring hopes, lived in memory. The new Tet had arrived with the sound of boots on roads and gunfire tearing through the night. Children listened from corners of the room, absorbing fragments of sentences they only half understood. They carried these fragments like seeds. Some would grow into questions, some into fears, and some into a strange, cautious sense of adulthood that came too early. Along the main roads, soldiers on both sides moved with a different kind of silence than before. Before Tet, marches were often accompanied by songs, chants, or at least the occasional exchange of jokes to lighten the burden. But after the offensive, voices thinned. The faces beneath helmets and behind rifles had changed. Not just older, but wearier, darkened by the sudden knowledge that the conflict was far from ending. Tet had been expected by leadership to shift the tide decisively, one way or another. Instead, it had blurred the edges of certainty. Now soldiers walked past the charred skeletal remains of market stalls and the ruins of homes, wondering what victory or progress could mean when so much of the land looked wounded. American troops, too, found themselves caught in the strange quiet that follows catastrophe. Campfire conversations grew more introspective. Letters home became longer, fuller, and sometimes harsher. Some men scribbled questions that they never sent, tearing the pages afterward. Others wrote simply to anchor themselves. The Tet offensive had revealed a gulf between what they had been told and what they now saw with their own eyes. The war, many felt, was shifting beneath their feet like loose sand. In Saigon, reports compiled in dimly lit rooms painted a picture that was both alarming and ambiguous. Negotiations, once seen as a distant, nearly theoretical possibility, now flickered to life, driven by exhaustion on one side and recalculated strategy on the other. Diplomats spoke in deliberately measured tones, each word weighed like a stone in the palm. They discussed pauses, possibilities, frameworks, and future frameworks for frameworks. And though little changed immediately on the ground, the very act of talking seemed to create a faint, fragile space where hope could breathe. But beyond the offices and conference tables, the city itself carried the scars of the assault. Saigon's neighbourhoods stirred each morning with a blend of resolve and trepidation. Families reopened small shops, tailors, noodle stalls, bicycle repair stands, not because it was safe, but because they needed to reclaim routine. The scent of broth simmering in street markets mingled oddly with the lingering smell of burnt metal. People moved quickly, glancing at rooftops and intersections, as though expecting shadows to shift again without warning. Yet they moved all the same, because life, even in war, insists on asserting itself. Hugh, meanwhile, found itself caught between grief and resilience. Its ancient walls had witnessed the fiercest battles of Tet, and the trauma clung to the air like mist on the perfume river. Monks swept temple courtyards in slow, meditative arcs, clearing debris while chanting prayers for the dead. Families searched for relatives, names spoken like small lanterns carried through darkness. And though the city's beauty had been marred, its spirit had not been extinguished. Amid collapsed buildings, flowers began to bloom again, wild, persistent, and quietly defiant. Across Vietnam, doubt spread as surely as smoke once had, not only among soldiers and civilians, but among leaders and strategists far from the front lines. The Tet Offensive had revealed the war's unpredictability. It had shown how quickly the ground could shift, how deeply the conflict reached into every household and every policy meeting. The certainty that once accompanied speeches and briefings now dimmed. Analysts pored over maps late into the night, seeing not just terrain but futures scattered, uncertain and costly. And yet, amid the exhaustion and doubt, something else took form, a sober clarity. People began to understand that whatever came next, whether escalation, de-escalation, negotiation, or something wholly unforeseen, the cost would not be measured solely in victories or losses. It would be measured in the lives quietly rebuilding amidst ruin, in the footsteps tracing paths through ash, in the quiet resilience of those who refused to be consumed by despair. As the weeks rolled into months, the land itself seemed to reflect this weary determination. Trees, blackened by fire, sprouted thin new leaves. Rivers ran muddy at first, then clearer, carrying away the remnants of battle. The monsoon clouds gathered again, heavy with rain. Villagers looked upward with a strange mix of gratitude and apprehension. Rain would nourish the fields, but it would also wash away traces of the past, some of which people still clung to, and some of which they wished desperately to forget. Negotiations continued in fits and starts. Promises were made, rephrased, withdrawn, and offered again. Peace, for the moment, remained more idea than reality. But its presence was no longer unimaginable. It existed at the edges of conversations, in the pauses between volleys of gunfire, in the soft murmurs of families sharing meals beneath patched roofs. Footsteps through ashes, this became the rhythm of Vietnam after Tet. A country moving forward, slowly but steadily, across ground both scarred and sacred. A nation caught between exhaustion and endurance, between doubt and the stubborn will to survive. Each step carried a story. Each trail led toward an uncertain horizon, and each heartbeat marked the quiet insistence that life, even amid devastation, must go on. The day the withdrawals began, the air felt strangely hollow, as though the land itself were holding its breath. For years the war had been a constant presence, its noise, its shadows, its marching boots and roaring engines, forming a kind of relentless backdrop. Now, as columns of trucks rumbled slowly toward coastal bases and helicopters lifted off for what would be their final journeys, an unfamiliar quiet pressed in from all sides. The long road home stretched before thousands of soldiers, American and Vietnamese alike, but each step toward that road carried the weight of everything they had endured. For American troops, the departure was not the triumphant return many had once imagined. Instead, it felt like slipping out of a storm, only to realize the storm had seeped into them. Young men who had arrived believing in clarity now boarded transport planes with questions they could not articulate. Some carried notebooks filled with memories they hoped to leave behind. Others clutched letters from home, worn soft from being read and reread during lonely nights. A few held nothing at all, their hands empty but trembling slightly, as if holding the shape of things they had lost. As planes rose over the coastline, soldiers pressed their faces to the small circular windows, watching the dense green forests recede beneath the clouds. The jungle that had once seemed almost alive with hidden danger now looked peaceful, entirely indifferent to their departure. Below, rivers wound like silver threads. Villages smoked gently, and rice paddies stretched in quiet rows. To many, the sight brought an ache deeper than fear, a recognition that they were leaving a place that had changed them forever, even if they never wished to return. Yet going home was not an end. In barracks and transport ships, men spoke more softly than before, trading stories not of victories, but of friendships, of near misses, of nights spent staring at the sky, counting hours until dawn. Some could laugh, others could not. A few avoided conversation altogether, preferring the company of their thoughts, though those thoughts were often sharp-edged and difficult to hold. The unseen wounds were the heaviest, memories that flickered in the mind without warning, dreams that jolted them awake, questions about guilt, purpose, or survival that had no simple answers. Back in the United States, their arrival was uneven. Some families greeted them with open arms, tears streaming, hearts bursting with the relief of seeing a familiar face step off the plane. Others welcomed soldiers quietly, unsure how to bridge the distance the war had created. And some returned to places where there was no one waiting, where silence met them more harshly than any battlefield. The world had changed in their absence. Streets looked the same, but conversations had shifted. Old friends seemed younger, somehow, untouched by the weight carried home from Southeast Asia. For many veterans, the hardest battles were the ones no one could see. The sudden quiet of civilian life felt unnatural. Crowds made them wary. Fireworks brought an instinctive flinch. A car backfiring could quicken the pulse in an instant. Some sought solace in long walks, some in work, some in drinking, some in the rare company of others who understood without explanation. They were home but not yet healed, and many wondered if they ever would be. Across the ocean, Vietnamese families faced their own long road. With the foreign troops departing, the war did not simply disappear, it shifted, rearranged itself, moved like a tide changing direction. Villages began the slow, difficult process of rebuilding. People gathered broken bricks and splintered wood, patching what they could, improvising new homes where old ones had been destroyed. Children returned cautiously to schoolyards, stepping around craters and shards of glass as teachers chalked lessons on still dusty boards. In the cities, especially in Saigon, life resumed in fragments. Coffee stalls reopened beneath torn awnings. Tailors set up makeshift tables in alleyways, stitching clothes amidst the hum of scooters and radios. Markets bustled again, though many shoppers carried grief alongside their baskets. Families searched for relatives who had vanished during the fighting. Sons drafted, fathers imprisoned, daughters sent fleeing to distant provinces. Every knock at the door brought a spark of hope, quickly snuffed out when the face on the other side was not the one they yearned for. The wounds here were different, but no less deep. Vietnamese civilians had seen their homes burned, their traditions upended, their sense of safety shattered. Entire communities had been displaced, wandering across the countryside in search of stable ground. Mothers stood in lines for rationed rice. Farmers tested soil poisoned by years of conflict, wondering whether the next harvest would grow at all. Buddhist temples filled with offerings, incense, fruit, small folded notes, prayers for peace, for guidance, for the return of missing loved ones. And yet, alongside sorrow came resilience. Children played again, their laughter echoing through half-ruined courtyards. Fishermen cast nets into rivers, as though reclaiming them inch by inch. Women planted new seedlings in fields that still held shrapnel beneath the surface, believing in seasons not yet born. The Vietnamese spirit, worn but unbroken, began stitching itself back together through the rhythm of ordinary tasks. Some families made difficult choices, sending young relatives abroad, moving to safer regions, or splitting households so at least part could endure. Others stayed rooted in place, determined to restore the towns and villages their ancestors had built. The landscape bore scars, but so did its people, and scars, they reminded one another, were proof of survival. As troop ships sailed away from the coast, and aircraft drifted into distant horizons, both nations entered a new, uncertain chapter. The war's physical battles were ending, but the emotional terrain ahead was vast and uncharted. For Americans, the journey home demanded patience, understanding, and time. Time to speak or remain silent. Time to process memories that refused to fade. For Vietnamese families, the path forward required rebuilding not only homes and schools, but trust, stability, and the sense of community that war had fractured. And still, even in the aftermath, life pressed forward. Rice stalks bent in the wind, bending but not breaking. Rivers flowed, carrying fragments of the past toward the sea. Children born after the conflict grew strong, unaware of the full scale of what their elders had endured. The long road home stretched not in miles but in years, years of healing, remembering, and choosing to live beyond the shadows of war. On both sides of the ocean, people stitched their lives back together one quiet day at a time. And though the wounds were unseen, they slowly, stubbornly began to mend, carried by the same enduring hope shared by all who survived the darkest chapters of history. That peace, however fragile, can take root even in fields once scorched by fire. Dawn broke over Saigon with a strange, unreal brightness, as if the sky itself hesitated to reveal what the day would bring. For weeks, rumours had drifted through the streets, whispers of collapsing lines, units dissolving, provinces falling one after another. People tried to continue their routines, but each morning felt thinner, more fragile, as the horizon darkened with signs that the end was drawing near. By the final days of April, the city pulsed with a nervous energy, a tightness in the air that no breeze could ease. And then, almost overnight, the weight of an entire era shifted all at once. The first unmistakable tremors came not from artillery, but from a single word passed from neighbour to neighbour, from shopkeeper to customer, from soldier to soldier. They're coming. The North Vietnamese forces were closing in rapidly, faster than anyone had expected. Families rushed to gather belongings, stuffing, clothing, money, and important papers into bags that suddenly seemed too small. Streets filled with motorbikes, bicycles, rickshaws, and crowds moving in every direction at once. A city trying desperately to escape itself. At the U.S. Embassy, lines began forming before the gates even fully opened. Women holding infants pressed forward, their faces streaked with sweat and fear. Men lifted aging parents by the elbows. Husbands and wives gripped each other tightly, and children cried without understanding why everything was happening so quickly. Staff members shouted instructions through the din, trying to maintain order as the desperate tide surged. Helicopters thundered overhead, their rotors chopping the humid air into frantic beats. Each landing brought a brief promise of escape. Each takeoff left hundreds staring into the empty sky, praying the next one would be theirs. Inside villas, apartments, and small homes across Saigon, families made decisions that would haunt them for decades. Some chose to flee, abandoning generations of memories packed into wooden chests and lacquered cabinets. Others stayed, believing they could weather whatever came next, or fearing that leaving would mean losing themselves entirely. On balconies, people burned documents that might endanger them. Diplomas, letters, photos, government forms paper that had once represented milestones now turned to ash in trembling hands. The smoke curled upward, mixing with the distant sounds of gunfire and the steady thrum of evacuation helicopters. As morning deepened into midday, the city's heartbeat grew erratic. Government officials disappeared from their posts. Soldiers discarded uniforms in alleyways. Policemen quietly slipped home, removing badges that no longer meant anything. On radio stations, announcements shifted from calm reassurances to panicked pleas to outright silence. When the broadcasts finally cut off for good, the quiet that followed felt like the world holding its breath. On rooftops across the city, the evacuation took on a feverish, dreamlike quality. Helicopters hovered like giant insects, landing on platforms barely large enough to support them. Marines ushered civilians into tight rows, pushing to fit as many as possible into each lift. Children were passed forward over the heads of strangers. Elderly parents were carried by men who did not know their names. Faces blurred into one another, fear, hope, disbelief, all merging under the relentless sun. When the rotors spun up, the wind whipped through everyone's hair and clothing, scattering papers, hats, and tears into the air. Below, on the streets, Saigon seemed to fray at the edges. Markets stood abandoned, fruit spoiling under the heat. Doors hung open in homes where families had fled without locking them. The smell of gasoline, sweat, and burning paper drifted through neighborhoods usually filled with cooking fires and children's voices. The city, once vibrant and chaotic with life, now felt suspended between collapse and surrender. News spread quickly. The presidential palace had ordered a ceasefire. Then came another message, the final transfer of power. The government that had stood for decades, through turmoil and war, had given way. Soldiers who had spent their youth fighting now leaned their rifles against walls, sitting down heavily as if the weight of everything they had endured suddenly pressed upon them at once. Some wept openly. Others stared blankly, their faces drained of expression. A few walked away, disappearing into the maze of streets without a backward glance. When North Vietnamese tanks finally rolled into the city, their engines growling like distant thunder, people gathered along sidewalks and balconies, watching the moment history stepped through their streets. A tank smashed through the gates of the palace, an image that would come to symbolize not only the fall of a city but the closing of an entire chapter of history. Soldiers climbed onto the steps, raising flags that had been carried across mountains, through forests, and along endless roads. The banners unfurled in the warm wind, bright against the pale afternoon light. For some, the sight brought relief, a promise of reunification, of an end to decades of division. For others, it brought heartbreak, the final confirmation that everything familiar was dissolving into an uncertain future. Children tugged at their parents' clothing, sensing the heaviness around them but unable to name it. Old men leaned on their canes, tears gathering at the corners of their eyes as they watched the symbols of one era replaced by those of another. Throughout the city, the sounds of helicopters slowly faded, replaced by the rumble of engines and the voices of new soldiers patrolling the streets. The evacuation had ended. Those who had escaped were now airborne, watching Saigon shrink beneath them until it became a watercolour of rooftops and winding streets. Many stared out windows with hollow eyes, not knowing whether they would ever return. Those who remained stepped cautiously into the evening air, listening to the unfamiliar quiet settling over the city. As night fell, lanterns flickered to life in a few remaining shops, casting thin pools of light onto broken sidewalks. People walked slowly, speaking in whispers, trying to understand the world as it had become in just a matter of hours. The city felt bruised, fragile, yet somewhere beneath the shock there was a deep stillness, the kind that follows a long, brutal storm. Saigon had fallen, an era had ended, and in the silence that followed, the weight of it settled over millions of lives, pressing gently but undeniably into the bones of a nation that would spend years learning how to breathe again.